Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy, where we try to better our perceptions of the world through philosophical discussion. As you can see, I am now here joined with Cloud of Time. Would you like to introduce yourself? One second there. I don't think you are coming through.
Okay.
Right. Sorry, there we go. Would you like to start again? Sorry, you are Cloud of Time.
Yeah, that's fine. I am Cloud of Time. I go by Eric as well in real life, and yeah, there's not much to say really. I'm interested in these sort of philosophical discussions. Definitely, as a layperson, not educated formally at all. Took an intro to philosophy class at one point, but really just interested in having a discussion with you about some specific details that I feel at least I haven't gotten a hold of. I haven't gotten a firm grasp on with how I've heard you explain them, and hopefully you can provide clarification on that. Wherever you want to go with the discussion is fine. I'm interested specifically in moral obligation, justification, requirement, and I'd like to get into suffering calculation at some point, but that's a kind of a secondary
Yeah,
topic.
yeah. That's fair enough, to be honest.
Okay.
Um, Sorry, continue.
Yeah, well, that's about it for introduction. I don't have a channel per se. I don't have any content that I really put out there that I need to tell everybody to go look up. So,
Well, that's no problem. I mean, obviously, if there is something you want to plug at the end, feel free to. And I'm happy to have you on. And I'm sorry it's taken this long to have you on. I have been meaning to have this conversation probably for a couple of months now. I think we've had a back and forth on some of the videos. That said, that you think that we could have a conversation, and then I'm the least organized person in the world, and here we are. So,
that's
you,
okay. That's perfectly fine. I mean, I'm glad to have a discussion with you. I know you've been having discussions with people who are, kind of more and more popular, and I'm glad to get in there. I'm sure there's a lot of people that are chomping at the bit
I do get a lot of
in order to.
messages at the minute. I have been getting a lot more. And if I'm honest, I've been focusing on trying to produce my course. So I haven't even been messaging anyone back for the most part. Um, but yeah, honestly, I don't really think it matters the size of the person that I talk to. If anything, I care more about the depth of the thought and the dialectic anyway. So for example, um I don't know. I care more about the arguments than anything else. So I'm interested, and I'm hopefully I'll be able to clarify some of the contentions. If not, then I'll go away. I'll do some research, come back, and we'll have a round two, and I'll do my best to answer the points of contention. So let's do it. So what is it
Okay.
about my ethical system that you find wanting?
Well, I feel like I've been coming along and grasping some of the things you've been saying. I, um, I feel like you almost got there with Cain, where he was questioning you on some things that have to do with obligation, and I kind of wanted to jump in there. I would you say that people are morally obligated to act in certain ways? Is that a way you would be okay with phrasing it?
Yes, I would say that. I'd say that what ethics is ethikos pertaining to behavior, and what we're actually trying to do is perform the right action, and the right action is that which is rationally deducible by any given agent. So, act
Okay.
as if your maxim could be made a universal moral law.
All right. I guess I have trouble with the definition of obligation. What actually an obligation is?
Yeah.
I guess you could even say metaphysically. Um, I guess metaethically. But what exactly makes the binding thing for obligation? Like when we look up definitions of obligation, like a legal obligation is pretty clear, right? You have, say, a group of people that decide upon a certain set of laws, and if they don't abide by those laws, there's some sort of enforcement, some sort of repercussion
Mhm.
against them. Um, Now, with moral obligation, I don't really quite understand what the binding thing is. When you say somebody is obligated to do a certain thing, what actually is the obligation? What is the binding essence there?
Well, I would say that it's more of like it's more about the compellingness of an individual's position. So it's like, if an individual has not got right reason behind that position, and if they discover that there is a more, let's say, um, let's take a hypothetical imperative. So hypothetical imperative, it's easy. The obligation is to, like, to try and like hit the, try and if, if I don't know, if helping old ladies across the street is good, then I should help old ladies across the street. And then like take it kind of like that. So it's like, it's purely hypothetical. The obligation in that scenario, in terms of like the word good, good, bad, right, and wrong. Typically, right is one of like, if helping old ladies across the street is right, for example, then the word is right, and that would be correct. And it'd be correct in relation to the motivation of action. So the individual acting and trying to discharge their will against the world is already doing so with an intention, a purpose, a deliberate, trying to change the world in such a way as to produce a certain outcome which is considered valuable in and of itself. And in a hypothetical imperative, that value is tentative upon the hypothetical. But in a categorical imperative, it is to say that there is something valuable and you act in accordance to bring around that value. So the obligation would be within the will itself, the fact that you are already trying to achieve that which is good or right. And typically, if you find out that there is a better way of obtaining it, then you would be, what's the word? It would be self-defeating, but there's a word that I'm looking for. That's, Hegel basically describes it as the irony of the subjective that tries to will its own will and ends up actually contradicting itself, like wills against itself. And so the obligation there is one in reason. It's one in which the force is the force of your will and of yourself onto yourself. It is what you should want for yourself.
Okay. And would you say that somebody would be able to will something that they aren't aware of?
Sorry, say that again. So someone be able to will something they aren't aware of.
Would somebody be able to have a will for something that they aren't aware of? Like I guess we can put this in a framing of like, okay, so a lot of times a heroin addict is brought up or something, right? And so what they will for is to take the drugs, right? Have that high. But what you were kind of saying is that they're doing something against their own will.
Yeah.
But if they aren't aware of it, where does that will sit? So if they aren't actually aware of it?
That's a really great point. I guess what I would say is that in terms of first order versus second order desires, when we understand desire itself, there is actually something common to it. And it's in every given first order desire, there shares a property which I would say that every individual is willing towards, which is like an experience of value, experience of good, that which is positive. And I think that you are willing towards that, whether you realize you are or not.
Okay. I think I'm more clear on your position there. Now I've heard you talk about obviously language games, interactions you have with other beings, and that giving you that your interactions with other beings allows you the ability to understand better what could be a more positive outcome for you, or could be a better approach to life, could be better for you. Is that a correct way of?
Could you say that first part again? Like, so like me, it was interactions with other beings, did you say? Sorry.
Yeah, you need to have a language game. You need to have these interactions and communication with other beings.
I see what you're saying. So like, yeah, I think that communication is vital for what's called determinate negation. So in Hegelian philosophy, this is essentially the ability to say that something is not what you think it is, and specifically in terms of worldview. So every individual comes from what I would say is a fixed position or like at least a a fixed subset of positions. So like the possibilities that an individual can think of independently, and that's based on their capacity for reason. It's also based on their capacities to like their biases and their psyche. Now, with another individual, you can negate that whole psyche, that whole worldview, and so you get the possibility of actually calling into question your conceived notion of good and your conceived notion of right. And so when someone tries to will something that they think is good for them, like the heroin addict, and they might be fully, like they might like not have questioned at all their desire for heroin. They might just genuinely, I want heroin. It is good for me. Or even if they have questioned it, they've overcome their, rational like kind of reason process, and they instead, they see themselves as trying to, as self-satisfying, as doing something that's in their benefit, whilst other people will see them as, essentially doing the complete opposite, as self-destructive. Now, this is probably because I would say it's because of the determinate negation. It's kind of like, think of it like this: a blind person would not know that they were blind unless they could talk to someone who could see.
Right. I've heard you explain that before. Like, you wouldn't be able to discern that one thing had a distinct identity if there weren't other things to compare it against. Right. Like if you were in an entirely red environment and you never knew anything else, would you be able to refer to this thing as a specific thing, like red? Would you be able to refer to that as a specific thing without having anything else to contrast it against?
Yeah.
You could call it what it is, but red itself is a distinct label for something that requires other things to make it distinct.
Absolutely,
Right?
absolutely. And this is in Hegelian philosophy. That's determinate negation, and that's one. I think it's one of the things that it's like Slavoj Žižek says. Like, I don't know if you've heard the joke. It's a guy goes into a coffee shop. He asks, "So I'd like coffee without milk, please." And say, "Sorry, we don't have milk. We only have cream. So you can have coffee without cream." And the what he's basically saying is there is actually a difference between asking for coffee from what is coffee without milk, and coffee without cream. They're all actually separate, objects. It's kind of like there's another joke he says, which is it's an old Soviet joke as well. I think it was in Poland there's actually a few of these he gives examples of. I don't know where he gets all these jokes from, to be entirely honest with you, for Hegelian determinate negation jokes. But like the guy goes into a shop in like Soviet Poland and he goes, "Excuse me, is this the shop without butter?" He's like, "Oh, sorry, I think is it? Do you have no butter?" And he goes, "No. You're looking for the shop that has no butter is across the street. This is the shop that doesn't have toilet paper." And there's another one where it's like, and I think more specific about identity, which is actually valuable for this one, which is actually a Jewish joke, which is like three Jews are in a synagogue. And a prolific Jew stands up, and he's a rabbi, and he says, like, "Oh my God, I am nothing, I'm worthless." And then the next guy stands up. He's a rich merchant, and he goes, "Oh my God, I am also nothing." And he sits down, and then the next guy stands up, and it's just a normal Jew, and he just says, "Oh my God, I am also nothing." And the merchant, nudges the rabbi, and he says, "Who does this guy think he is, saying that he can also be nothing?" And it's the idea that being nothing in and of itself, in that sense, is an identity which gives separation from you and others, and so adds a certain self-understanding. And in this case, it has existential purport. The ability to gain social power over another. It's kind of like when liberals say that they're so oppressed and they're victims, or I'm a white man and you're a victim, and in reality, it's the way to make themselves actually more powerful. And people don't see the actual games going on. But this is all through what Hegel would title as determinate negation.
Okay. So bringing it back to the obligation point. So obligation is just kind of an alignment thing, that the best of all possible outcomes for this person would they're obligated to that in the sense that they're just, if they are in alignment with it, that would be um, better for them. And you're determining better by some process of reasoning, right? And so how do you get to the concept of what is better for an individual without having access specifically to their thoughts and
Well,
their emotions?
I guess what I would actually say is that their thoughts and emotions, if private, are incapable of obtaining knowledge, like making knowledge claims against. There's no truth maker there. I would say that in terms of their nature, that's what we can analyze. So like what they are, like, so for example, we know that you're a human. We know that, humans typically feel X way, when given this scenario. We know that like there are certain like expressions which are atypical of you as a person, which are public. These things that we can talk about, but an internal private state from which an individual is, the only one that can have access. I don't even think that they can have knowledge over that sort of thing. And I think this is where I would, I would take it as what makes someone what they are is a universal that's applied to them, and this is almost very Aristotelian. It's like we are actually in Aristotelian philosophy, we're a member of a species. And that species is given meaning by the definition which is applied to the form. That's the form that's applied to matter. And then that matter that actually exists as that individual is an accident. And the accident we can't know and we can't understand. We can't gain knowledge of an accident. But we can gain knowledge of the universal. And that's where I stand on like, for example, what would be mind and right in terms of individuals. And I think this is where Hegel says, like, the individual finds themselves in the universal.
Okay. I guess since we're on the universal point, I know you discussed this with Kane a little bit.
We basically just talk straight past each other, me and Kane. I would love to talk to him again. I hadn't slept at all really when I was talking to Kane, and honestly, I think he's a really great guy. But sorry to interrupt, by the way. He's a really great guy. I just think that like someone said it right, like in the Discord, it was like two aliens speaking different languages. Like we're just not like I was just like, why don't you understand? And then he's like, what the hell are you talking about?
Well, it seems like you were coming from different foundations, and it was a long discussion. But yeah, it's difficult. A lot of these philosophical conversations can get tangential because you have to go through all these different topics, and then you have to go to the foundations of those topics. And especially when you're coming from two completely different approaches. I see you talking to a lot of people who seem to have very different approaches through metaphysics. I mean, you're an idealist, right?
Yeah.
So you interact with a lot of people who aren't idealists.
Materialists everywhere.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of contention there and a lot of ground to cover. But when it comes to the universal point, I just there's some different way. Let me ask this: could you imagine somebody? Would you think it would be possible for there to be a person who, say they want to just do drugs, burn out, party? They only want to, they don't care about living a long life. They don't care about that. They just want to experience these preferences that they immediately have. And do you think it would be possible for them to come to some sort of second order reasoning that all of the other things you might say would be better for them, they actually don't consider to be better for them? And they have just naturally, subjectively, higher value for this doing drugs, burning out, and only existing for several months, and then dying and having no issue with it.
So I would say that like the subjective agent itself is a product of objectivity, which is where it's like objectivity gives us all like the capacity to have like an identity. Everything before that point is an unknowable. I wouldn't say that. In fact, I would even say that when you try to express your subjectivity through non-objective means, you're actually acting in a contradictory way. from which you could not know whether you're acting in your own interests or acting, against them. And I think Nietzsche makes this point greatly. And like people try to act in their interests all the time, like, and they think even in terms of ethics and morality, their preferences and so on. But he even says like the genealogy of the morals that you have are, wills that have like essentially instantiated like feelings of guilt and so on inside of you from classes of individuals that have interests of other classes of individuals. Like he points towards the warrior class and the what is it, the warrior class and the priest class, and as basically keeping the masses in line, and the warrior class using the priest class as a way to essentially instantiate their power, and the priest class doing it so that they can essentially gain like value in relation to the existential game going on. And I think that like why would you think that like what you're doing is in your interest? Like what justification do you have to think that when you're trying to express these positions that you're not actually just expressing the will of someone else that's moving through you?
I guess I would want to push back and say, well, how do you or how does anybody else determine that for them if they can't even do it themselves through their own experience, through their own emotions and feedback with their environment?
Well, I guess I would say that it's not that. I would say that once they've established an identity, and once and if they use objective means to engage with their environment, so like understanding themselves through like universals, then they can gain knowledge and they can apply and test these concepts out for themselves. It's whether they think that they have inherent knowledge of themselves, which would be like, I know myself, I know what's good for me, rather than like, look, I actually see, like when I've applied these concepts, I've noticed I feel considerable amounts of suffering. You know what I mean? And then you have a dialogue of whether this suffering is actually, why it would or would not be better. And this is where it would be based off reasons. And I think without those reasons and without right reasons around that situation, then it would be it'd be futile. But then this is kind of the contention then would exist between a form of egoism and a form of like objective ethic in terms of like altruism, and I'd happily debate that point, I think, with anyone. But I think that's a considerable far cry away from like a subjectivist position.
Okay. I guess this is all just a little bit removed from how exactly maybe going more into like how we approach these things, like more of an applied position.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about causing somebody to realize that something is better or not for them? I've heard you say, here, let me check the notes real quick. I've heard you said
No
something
problem.
about referring to somebody's rationality. How do you determine that you have the knowledge, that you've acquired the knowledge for what is more rational
Mm.
for that person's state? And if it has to do with a psychological state, would this not just be an appeal to nature of some kind and have it lead back to more of a primary first order thing?
Well, I think it's. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be an appeal to nature, but it would be a form of naturalism. Like you'd have to, look towards an individual's like nature and try and ground it in something which is, their being itself, like in a form of like, what they are, and try and kind of build it up from there. And I think that like that's where like you get the idea of like they're a will trying to discharge its strength against the world in such a way that it's, and they're also a human. It's a will, but in human form, and it's also, and these are the, the bodily requirements of that. These are the, you need certain desires fulfilled in order to survive, for example. So certain desires are contingent upon other desires, and the so there is a level of naturalism there, in relation to the function of what we are, but then. As well, I think you said. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
As it goes, I asked you kind of two separate things, though.
Yeah. All right. Sorry.
As it goes back to the going to a first order thing, I mean, I'd rather dig in on this first point, though, where so not necessarily an appeal to nature. I know you see these things differently, so that, see, to me it appears like a descriptivist sort of a view, where you're saying it's better if people are more in alignment with this way of living, that has some sort of rationality to it, that if they live in this way with regard to this reasoning process, that would be better for them.
Mhm.
Um, I guess that goes back to the obligation thing, that the should is really just saying that it would be better for you if this were the case. But if somebody doesn't do that, um, I guess why is somebody obligated to? Why should somebody live in a way that is better for them under this perception? Say that they don't live in that way. Say that they don't
Well, they
constantly
could
try to
desire
follow
their
the
own
path.
self-destruction, for example, and I think that's something that people
Sure.
do all the time. Sorry to interrupt. I was just
No, it's
trying.
fine.
Yeah, people do that all the time, and I think that, like, actually, if you know, you Slavoj Žižek, Lacan, Freud, this idea of a death drive, almost this idea of like the individuals actually desiring their own suffering and self-destruction, as
Well,
well.
it's not just about that, because that would then be like that could be then a mistaken thing, like what you're saying, right? Like if somebody was wanting to destroy themselves, or had some sort of appearance of a preference, some perceived preference to destroy themselves, that still wouldn't necessarily be best for them according to how you see it, right?
Yeah, exactly. But and it wouldn't be an appearance of a preference. It would be a preference. It would be a desire. It wouldn't be
Okay.
and it would be a partly rational desire. And I think that's, like, I would say that all desires are rational in some respects. I think that um, some are, like, second order desires are desires from which we have chosen the content of the desire ourself. So, as in, like, we've managed to choose between the system of drives in relation to what we are, the concepts that are available to us, and formulated a desire that seems to meet the criteria of what would lead to what we believe to be a good life.
Okay.
And it's like
Hmm.
in relation to, like, whether we could tell someone that they were, wrong or not. Where do I get that knowledge from? It's not that I would have that knowledge. I think that I would fall back on institutions for the most part, and those especially the law, but also institutions which gauge, which contain reasons that are agreed upon by multiple agents. So I fall back on reasons independent of any given agent. The law is just one aspect of, like, justice in society, but you've also got, like, the family. You've got, like, various institutions from which people engage ethically and try to determine right behaviors between each other. And these are the areas from which I would fall back to duty and obligation in relation to those reasons which have formed. I think our society has progressed in some ways and then regressed in others. I think a good example would be something like welfarism, animal rights. I think animal rights has progressed considerably. And so is, like, civil rights movements. But at the same time, we are seeing some shortfalls. I think, people hating white guys, for example, talking about whiteness as if it's a thing. Um, a lot of and, like, some form of, like, ideological privilege within society necessarily, and not considering the intersectionality of it, whilst claiming to be intersectional and saying whiteness is always better, which completely defies the intersectional approach in the first place. Um, and then there's, other things. There's, like, I'm trying to think of, like, other ones. There's, like, people using, people being more consumerist and hedonistic in their behaviors. The fallen of the, like, the churches and those institutions which contained ethical knowledge, but it was tied to a form of mysticism which was rejected, and then the knowledge of the ethics was rejected alongside with it. These are the kind of things that I think are, tantamount to whether, like, society's actually getting better or worse. But ultimately, the reasons exist, and we should evaluate them. And I'd say that if you want to, like, a really good resource on that, and, like, whether we should, like, how we should evaluate tradition and so on, check out, and this is for anyone in the audience as well, Gadamer, Truth and Method, and his conversation on Bildung, philosophical Bildung.
Do you Can you spell the author?
Gadamer. So that's Gadamer.
Okay. Um, so it's truth and method.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's better to do. So is reason good? Would you say that reason is good? Is that
Reason, it's
appropriate
not
way to
that
put it?
reason is good. I mean, like some people describe in continental philosophy as reason as freedom. And I would say that. I would say that. So reason is the ability to act in a way as to discharge your strength to the greatest degree. And so I'd say that's what you that's what you are. That's what you are trying to do, and reason gives you the capacity to do that.
And I guess I don't really know this from you. How would you define goodness?
Ooh.
How would you define what is good?
I'm always a bit skeptical on goodness because of the Hegelian morality versus right. I think that people have rationally deduced notions of goodness, but they come from an individualistic position. So like I think I know what good is, you think you know what good is, and we all act in an intention to try and produce a good action. But ultimately, it's somewhat relative and subjective. It actually doesn't comport to reality. And then when we actually discuss and talk about how we ought to behave, we merge those notions of goodness together and we form a notion of abstract right, which is objective and it's went through a process of deductive reasoning, but and independent of any given agent. Until that point, I think it's I don't want to say totally subjective, but even like relative.
Okay, so would I be correct in saying that you're kind of engaging in a probability game here, where because you kind of disregarded the possibility that somebody could just want to burn out and that would be better for them, do these drugs and just engage in like immediate preferences until they die or whatever.
Well, I rejected it in the sense that if it was that or abstract right, if abstract right was to find out that that actually was, excuse me, in their interest, then it's like, for example, had this talk, excuse me, with Mr. Lydia, I'm already jumping ahead. I had this talk with Vegan Gains about Mr. Meeseeks, like the Meeseeks and all that, who, the nature is to want to die because they live in eternal suffering. It's like, I was like, yeah, kill them. Like, for the love of God, kill them. Like they're like it's actually in their interests.
Okay.
And it's like, the issue is if someone comes along and it's like, let's say there was a Mr. Meeseeks who looks like a human and we have no reason to think that he's anything but a human, he's unfortunately something that he's an outlier, and there's no way he could know or we could know that it was actually in his interests for us to kill him until we get a better grasp of reality itself and his nature, find out that he is in fact a Mr. Meeseeks, and that's the kind of the way in which I would say about it. It's like it very well might be the case that there might be that one individual that might genuinely have had a better life, that burnt out, like took drugs and destroyed themselves, and it might have been a better life for them. The issue is that like there is no reason to believe that, and if there's no reason to believe that, then in assuming that, then we could be committing an act which was even worse. It's like we are already in a probabilistic, we're in a gamble already. And when you're going into a gamble, all you have is reason, right? You have, a value on this side and a value on that side. And all you can do is pick the best odds,
Okay, yeah, that's pretty much what I was getting at. So there's a probability here, but you do acknowledge that there's the possibility that there are people out there like this who are their nature, or however it is that their neurological states, whatever it is, make it so that they are actually distinct from the universal group. And
Yeah.
so if you have this generalized universal, you're going to have these outliers. So there are likely going to be these individuals for whom
Likely
you
or
can't
not
apply.
is contentious. I think that like the probably will be. And obviously there'll be areas in which are grey, and we'll have to refine our notions of abstract right. But all in all, and again, that would still have to consider everyone involved in their natures. for it to be, understandable. Um, but yeah, like once, if we were to find out, someone was like, live a better life like that, then yeah, absolutely. But I guess the issue is like obviously there'll be no knowledge on that part. So even when I say like it's a gamble, like what I really mean is like, um, absolutely no chance of knowledge. Like every single action could be as much or as like in your favor or not. Whilst on the other hand, there is the possibility of knowledge. So it's like impossibility and possibility of knowledge. You're kind of forced to go on the side of possibility. You have to assume that like you can't understand reality. It's like take for example. Otherwise, would fall into some sort of absurdism, and I think at the end of the day, you end up being forced to at least accept a level of fictionalism, regardless. So, I was actually going to say as well, like there's actually, I can't remember what I was going to say, so it doesn't matter. Like, continue.
That's okay. Okay, so it's based on a probability, which is fine. There's kind of a pragmatic approach here that you're left with only this much information, and you're trying to make the best of it going forward, or trying to get the most use of it going forward. Is that fair? You kind of nudge. Was that
kind of
fair?
I mean, like it's probabilistic, but only after you've accepted reason in the first place. So it's like the only reason that we would understand that it's probabilistic and there could be outliers is from the fact that we've engaged in ethics, understood the fact what we're engaging in, built up arguments, and then applied them to reality, and then saw like, well, wait a minute, it might actually form like contradictions. And I think that this in Hegel would be like this is how we'll lead to straight states of tragedy, where like we actually think we're doing what's in, like we'll create a law or a duty, and in creating those duties we'll have a confliction in duty, and then we'll have a state in which an individual is just as right to perform either action, and so are in a state of absolute like disarray, in which like, so for example, a starving mother who steals to feed her child knows it's wrong to steal, knows she should feed her child, and in either case she's just as right to not steal and to feed her child. And this is where Hegel says like, look, this is where the ethical institutions step in, and I think they did to some degree in the first off, where people will go simply, you have a greater obligation to your child than to the state, and then in a secondary sense for the state to go, we will relieve this circumstance and bring an end to this confliction within the will, and that creates the greatest opportunity for freedom.
Okay, so it's left up to the relative reasoning of the institution at that time and in that location.
Yeah, it's like you've hit the limits of rationality at that point,
Mm-hmm.
and you're in a state of like where you are trying to deduce whether what you are doing is right by yourself. And I would say you fall back onto what like Hegel describes as heroic morality, and I think this is what heroes are. So I think heroes, when we talk about going beyond the call of duty, you get someone like Batman or someone like that. I'm going to me up. And he's in the situation where the institution of the law has absolutely failed, and Gotham's in absolute disarray. He understands the purpose of the law, but it's not functioning. Now he can't choose not to act, because if he chooses not to act, then he's accepting the status quo. If he chooses to act, then he's taking it upon himself to act in regards to the institutions, but the institutions aren't good enough. So he's the only thing that he can do is try and bolster the institutions. And then you have this idea of like, he's a single individual as a vigilante trying to, rescue the institutions. It's like, he's absolutely wrong, but he's more right than he is wrong for the fact that he's establishing the institutions. He's re-establishing the institutions on what is like no man's land in terms of ethics.
Okay, that's a bit of a complex scenario, because you got the institutions and the intention of the institutions, but there's something wrong with the institutions. But this is the idea that any person of a reasonable, rational mind would say that the institutions are broken and they aren't actually functioning the way they're supposed to. And this is left up to individual minds as well. But there's some sort of underlying agreement about the community, right? Like Batman's doing what is good. We love Batman, because he's supporting the institutions that we agree with. But the institutions themselves are being represented typically by a government, which isn't in this case, it's like a representative government. So it's not necessarily representing the like in like a pure democratic sense what everybody feels or the majority of people feel, right? So it's more of a label of an institution, but it's not a truly representative institution. Um, whereas with this idea that the institution is making the tiebreaker for this person who's saying that should my child come first, or should the law come first with the stealing or whatever. It's all still relative, and I think it's just difficult. It's just difficult when it comes to application. Is one of the things I'm having trouble with. Now you're going to have these outliers that you seem to have admitted, and I guess it's just getting to that point. Is just, have you ever engaged with somebody who believes and has conveyed that reason is kind of a delusion, that you're putting your trust in something when the first order preferences are more reliable, because it's like, as you as an idealist, I'm sure can understand, you're within your experience, and whatever you're engaging with in the moment would be more reliable than taking for granted what everybody in the institution is saying as a universal, or trying to apply it ubiquitously, and that their reason could just be a delusion, especially if you're one of those outliers who is experiencing something that is like antithetical to what they're trying to implement.
Well, I think I would actually definitely push back on that and say that the only reason that they have these, like, these first order desires in the first place, like these, like, kind of like this ready to hand state from which they're experiencing, is a conditioned state anyway. I don't think that humans exist in a non-conditioned reality. And so like we've already like changed the way in which we experience reality in the first place. So you're already, like, there is two things to be said here. The first is that the individual who purely relies upon intuition, is, begging the question. I think the promoting their position as right in and of itself without reasons to say that it is right in and of itself, and are relying upon that as a form of argumentation. So when they say that reason is a form of delusion, well, what did you use to come to that conclusion? Reason, like, and this is
Can't they just define that as right? Whatever in their experience is showing them something that they find to be preferential at that moment.
Well, this is where I would say that, one, I think that grammar and language is is reason, and that is rationally functional, which is the kind of like the Hegelian dialectic. We're actually forming a level of reason and comprehension of reality in the first place. But like if you try to define this as right and you're just trying to assert that this is right, then what you've actually tried to do is, define the parameters of reality in relation to what you perceive to be justified or not, without any justification for that. So you're actually engaged in reasoning, but you're trying to force reasoning to confirm your bias. You're in inductive reasoning. It's not that you've managed to reject reason. You're just doing a different kind of reason. Now, I would say that inductive reasoning essentially is flawed, because if the purpose of reasoning in the first place is to identify reality as it is, and as it is that which we can say is verifiable or falsifiable, and in the sense like through investigation. So like true justified belief. And I think that if they're relying upon intuition, then it's not true justified belief. There's no reason to believe that over its negation. And so like I don't think that anyone can like kind of get out of normativity. And I think Kane like kind of tried to do this with like the meta metaphysics kind of arguments, like metaphysical expressivism and stuff. And honestly, I find those positions the least convincing of any position I've ever heard in my life. I think that, one, because I think that in the words of Lacan, like all language is object language, so we're actually creating a form of normativity just to speak in the first place, and that normativity exists between agents, and so when we try to say like, oh well, we can pick and choose which norms we can engage with, it's like absolutely not. They've been chosen for you before you were born, and then the second point I would say is that in terms of like why this exists in the first place, I would say that it's because we are trying to understand something which already exists, and we're applying a signifier to that, and the appropriate application of the signifier is judged not by the normativity, but by the engagement with reality. Normativity is judged by reality in correspondence with reality itself. And so I would argue for like a form of like logos, but like, it would 100% get contentious there with me and Kane. I can imagine. But I find that those arguments like the least convincing. And I think Aristotle did a pretty good job at showing like why there are certain like aspects of logic, even back 2,000 years ago, where an individual's argumentation is already using these normative positions to try and dismiss the normative positions. And I think like my friend Dave puts it very well when he says it's like trying to talk yourself out of words. It's like you can't reject the normativity of in your language because you're already conditioned by your language to understand reality through your language, and so you're actually just trying to say that like your language from which you're speaking in is false, and it's a paradoxical relationship with yourself.
You're trying to understand it through the thing that you've come to try to understand it through. It's like you can never get underneath it, it seems.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But
I mean, that's the Wittgensteinian point. Like, language is the limits of, our world, and I would agree with that to one respect. I think language is not like language is the limits of what we can know, as in terms of in a determinate sense, but language itself. The limits of language give an indication of what isn't language. And that's the Lacanian point of saying that the absence of a signifier indicates an aspect of reality which is real and unsignified. It's where there is nothing is infinite possibility of the thing.
Okay. Interesting. Would you say that you've ever been an anti-realist, a moral anti-realist or non-realist of some kind?
No, but I was very convinced by Nietzsche for a while. Like, as in, I was very concerned because I read Nietzsche and I was like, "Oh shit," and I'm like, "Oh my god, this guy could be right." And it took us years of just like, because I'm not going to be like inauthentic with it. Like, I'm gonna have to like, I was not okay with describing myself as a moral realist until I could overcome Nietzsche. And so I spent like a solid year just trying to defeat Nietzsche's arguments, like test it. Like I was like, oh my god, I'm going insane. And I found I found that I eventually I think that Nietzsche and his position on the will is better explained by Hegel, and that really helped because I think Nietzsche's position on Kant, on the Kantian position, was quite strong, and I was a Kantian at the time, and he just ripped Kant apart in front of my eyes, and it was quite upsetting. But he did us a favor in the end. So
okay, and I guess I'm kind of interested in your history a little bit, how you've found your way through these ideas, where you started, what ideas you encountered, and how they led to different things. Like, did you bounce your way through different moral positions, like different concepts about morality,
So
whether it be like moral subjectivism or error theory or anything like that? Did you find yourself shifting in between and actually being convinced by these before you came to this position, or were you just kind of
if I'm
playing with
honest,
ideas?
I've actually always found those the least convincing positions. When I was at A level, for example, I found because I've done that. So, for example, I studied the logical positivists, and I heard like one of the things that we study is the counter arguments straight away. So it's like, here's the arguments, here's the counter arguments, and it's put in a very spoon-fed kind of way. And obviously they weren't as complex as the actual full-fledged, like if you go into the degree and level stuff and you read the books themselves and you see their positions. But in a way that was broken down, it's like it became abundantly clear that like the logical positivists, I think, had a very I don't think that was very good. I think AJA's position was pretty bad. I think that Mackey's is harder to deal with, but not really. So for example, I found Mackey harder to deal with, but I feel that was a lot of what I struggled with Mackey was more with understanding Mackey himself. and why he was coming to his argument about like metaphysical queerness and or like was it epistemological queerness and stuff like that. And like I kind of understood when I was a Kantian, and like Mackie's point was a lot more a lot more prominent to us then. But then I thought that it was explainable in relation to at the time when I first read Mackie, I think I took it as like explainable in relation to I think it was a theory of mind. Oh no. Yeah, it was actually, I think it was just a theory. It was of right reason. It was of right reason, and then in terms of like the Hegelian point, like Mackie is just, I feel like Mackie got kind of just absolutely decimated from that. And I feel like a lot of what happened with Mackie was more of a semantic issue where it's like the semantics of an individual's definition of good. And like Hegel kind of touches on that in any ways, like why do we define good, and like why do so many people like talk about good in so many different ways. And I feel like like G.E. Moore basically loaded the gun for Mackie, and then Mackie ran with the argument and didn't do it very well. So I wasn't very convinced with Mackie. I'm trying to think of who the most convincing, like if I'm honest, like I don't really find any of the negative positions convincing, and the positive positions really are just like, all right, so this is ethics is expressive, or ethics is morality is expressive, or morality is like quasi-realist or whatever, and then it's built from that like a lot of the time. I think the only person that I found truly convincing was Nietzsche. Very, very hard to overcome. I think it was just far more mature in terms of his like development of his thoughts, at least in my opinion. But I'm also not an analytic, so I don't enjoy reading the work. I find the arguments like a little bit under, like a little bit less nuanced. If I'm honest, like I feel like there's a lot more depth in something like Nietzsche, where it's like this, like fucking, like it's a series of books that are like 600 pages long, where he's talking about the human condition and like the genealogy of morality and like the historical arguments, there's fucking logical arguments in there. He's taking Kant apart. He's arguing with he's arguing against even Schopenhauer, and like there's this whole like position going on, and he's even relating it back to the ancient Greeks and the what we're actually trying to express when we're trying to engage with reality. And then if I read something like a single article, it's like, right, well, no, but yeah, I guess I think that I was a Catholic first as well, so that's probably important in terms of my philosophical development. Like I come from a position which is really like was half rational philosophical Thomism, really. So,
well, would you have any recommendations for Nietzsche? You said there's like these series of books, but like if you were to take a path through Nietzsche to go through the experience you went with him, what would you recommend? Or
The Birth of Tragedy is such a brilliant book. That's his like first work, really, like his first like prominent, like prolific work. And he's just discussion on like the Apollonian and Dionysian values, I think is really really great. And then I would say I would probably say like go from something like The Birth of Tragedy, and then maybe to either. I don't want to. Try and make this as like
that's okay.
I'd probably say like for me I would say I'd probably say from that to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but
Okay.
only if you're ready for something that's just like, especially if you take like the King James like kind of translation version of it. It's like, it's very much like it's like modeled after the King James Bible. It's like very like these and thous, and um, it's a strange read. It's very metaphorical and like allegorical. So be ready for that. If you really, you don't have to like actually like sit and go like, what the hell does he fucking mean here in this story where he's like, Zarathustra like rocked up to this town, and then there was this joker who was like, you know, like tightrope and some like on a tightrope, and then it leads to someone's death, and you're gonna have to like sit there and go, what the fuck did I just read, and like think about like you know, what was actually going on, and
That sounds silly. Yeah.
it's actually great as a work. And I think that like in that piece, like the three metamorphoses of the spirit is one of my favorite sections that Nietzsche has ever written. I love the metamorphoses of the spirit. You know, like the three metamorphoses of the spirit I give unto thee. Like honestly, absolutely great. Like from from the camel to the lion to the child, or the baby, really great. Then after Thus Spoke Zarathustra, maybe either Beyond Good and Evil, honestly, Beyond Good and Evil, or probably like Beyond Good and Evil, or what's it called, like maybe The Gay Science or something. I'd probably recommend. And then if you want like a nice summary of his position on the genealogy of morality, just pick up the genealogy of morality. Really, that's like that literally just that it's probably the easiest one to read. So really, maybe the genealogy of morality, just to give you a good introduction to Nietzsche, and then The Birth of Tragedy is my favorite, and I think it gives you a good explanation of Nietzsche. The Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and then maybe he's like Beyond Good and Evil, I'd say.
Okay. Perfect. I only have about 20 minutes left. I have to go and get vaccinated. It just became available in my area, so I got to go.
Oh, that's cool. I mean, I'm obviously I could probably do with going off, and anyways, it's
but I there is something I wanted to get to. I hope this hasn't been too boring for people. People weren't expecting me to be too challenging. I had something I wanted to run by you. I was doing some sort of investigation into concepts of like the supererogatory, suberogatory, things like that. And I came across this paper that for some reason I couldn't find again. I let it go because it wasn't getting at what exactly I needed. And then for some reason it like disappeared from my history, or I'm just wasn't capable of locating it. But it had this idea in it that I've expanded upon more. It's the idea of how we calculate suffering. And like I'll hear from a lot of vegans. I don't know if you know, I didn't explain my background to you at all. I was vegan for just over 2 years. About a year and a half ago, that stopped. But
we've got to get you back on Team Vegan, man. Absolutely.
And I'm listening to you, man. I mean, you've got good stuff. I just need to I need to grow and be able to understand it at some point. I'm kind of dense at some things, but
I don't think so.
Well, this idea of suffering calculation, I hear a lot of vegans say, you know, this many, like, you know, 80 billion, you know, cows are slaughtered in the US every year, whatever the number happens to be. And, and I think it's close to that. And then, you know, this many land animals and trillions, and there's a suffering calculation that people seem to have in their minds and how they explain things, where the more suffering there is, the more beings that experience suffering gives a greater overall suffering. And this idea I've come across is that, does that make sense to you? Is that how you see it as well?
Yes, but I mean, I'll take the more like, so like, I think that a lot of people take that position, but I think utilitarianism is pretty much the standard ethic that most people apply in reality. And I'm obviously not a utilitarian. So I think a lot of people are like, well, wait a minute, like there is this much suffering. Do you think this suffering is okay with that amount of pleasure? And, you know, they're trying to do this kind of like almost hedonic calculus. Whilst I would say that in reality, what we should be looking at is and it kind of overcomes the problem that Derek Parfit talks about. In and like there's this, it's like so for example, if there are 10,000 people and they're all experiencing a moderate amount, no, a very good life. They're all experiencing very good lives. But and let's say that's like the value of like 10 out of 10. And then let's say you could have another 5,000 people who are experiencing okay lives. Like they're not good, but they're not really bad, but that's slightly positive. But the actually, or even 50,000 of them like experiencing like that. So let's say the overall value is greater than it would have been if they didn't exist. So the 10,000 people's value, like the experience that they have, is worth like 10 out of 10. But like the experience they're having is like 1 out of 10, but there's 5 times as many of them. If you put both the groups together, especially, you can only conclude that more is better. And Derek Parfit was like, well, wait a minute, how the fuck do we overcome that? Because clearly it's not the case that like if we have like people living marginally okay lives, that it's better than people were living like, or than if people were living just higher and higher quality lives with lower amounts of people. Why are we valuing quantity over quality of experience, right? And then people try to fiddle with the like, oh well, wait a minute, like well, quantity is like of a greater value than and it ends up with that. Well, what I would say is that in reality, it's instead of looking at it as if it is, like in terms of numbers, in terms of how many people there is, think of it in terms of one, the will, absolute spirit, and think about the contradictions in will that are experienced by those, what's the word I'm looking for? Iterations of the will. So if there are like 50,000 fuck ups of it in the will, then that's the will willing against itself 50,000 different occasions, and that's not as good as if the will was even willing itself once to a better degree.
Okay. Yeah, this kind of plays upon the idea that I was getting at here. I wanted to kind of get your take first, and it's that the way what seems to be meaningful about suffering, the way that we put value on suffering is through our experience, right? And our experience includes the experience of others, especially as humans, right? We can see suffering in others or family members or whoever, even animals, right? And we can feel that will increase our experience of suffering if we see them suffering because we have that empathy. But if we were going to isolate this, so to make it easier to understand, if we take a hypothetical universe where you just have one being in it, say a non-human animal, and that being is isolated, it's suffering the maximal amount of suffering it can experience, and then you put another being into that universe separated from the first one, and that being is also suffering the maximal amount that it could possibly suffer. Now, I think the way a lot of people would see it is that now you have twice the suffering in this universe. You have double the amount of suffering.
But double infinity is infinity, isn't it?
Sure.
So like,
right, yeah. But I think the way of perceiving this is wrong, because there's no being that is actually experiencing double amount of the suffering, right? There's only two individual subjects having their own experience of suffering, right? So there's two instances of being suffering, but really as the meaningfulness of suffering is how we experience it ourselves. And so it seems like it's not really an accurate way to depict suffering, that you have, a million beings all experiencing the maximal suffering they can experience and having a million times. Okay.
I would say, because specifically in the words that you use, it was exactly the point that I would be trying to make against it. The meaning of suffering actually exists between them. And that's something I think that's really important. It's not simply that the suffering would not be as bad if judged by a party who was a third member who was not suffering at all, because suffering itself would be of a lower degree in that tripartite system. But and so the more, essentially facets of suffering that you add to this complex, suffering distribution network, the greater amounts of um, essentially like truth makers you are going to have or for that definition, for that form. So like the actual meaning will be more apparent and occur to a greater degree within reality. This suffering is happening more here, here. It's happening more because it's also happening there, there, and it's the same suffering.
So yeah, I can see that a little bit with the, like, that's why I tried to isolate it, the universe with the separated beings. As we put it into how we actually experience life, we're engaging in this complex of suffering with the people around us, with other beings, and so that has an effect on our experience of suffering. But maybe I'm just not understanding what you're
Well,
you're saying here.
think of it like this. Think of it like this. The word that you're using, you're calling it suffering. You're already applying an identity and a formal cause to it. You're already trying to
Sure.
explain it and give it meaning. What you're saying is like, let's say if we were to remove all other individuals and we simply just have the experience of suffering, but it wasn't attributed this meaning. It's not that it's not there. It's that we do not know of it. It's that we cannot speak of it. And so it very well might be as bad, and in many ways, for that being, it is as bad. But the point is, it could not know it was as bad, and we could not know it was bad without the attribution of suffering, which is attributable to all these different scenarios.
I'm sorry, I don't understand that. I wish I did. I'm not getting how it may be a difficulty with understanding, because you're very knowledgeable in these types of concepts of meaning, and you have a position on them and how they relate to this entire community of people understanding things. But I guess so if I take it from my personal experience and how I perceive that I've existed through life so far, encountering different things, concepts, interactions with what appears to be physical reality, and I take my emotions and what I feel, this instance of it, I can't share it with anybody else. At least I can't appear to, aside from, somebody uh, taking for granted they have a perception of me and they may feel a certain way based on how I express myself. And I can only assume that based on how I feel about them. I see them going through something, it may have a good effect on me I prefer, or effect on me that I am repulsed by. Um, but I can only see this being an instance like that. Nobody else actually has to experience the suffering that I am specifically going through, and the way I understand it, that's the only. I have to say meaningful. Again, there's that
Well,
word.
I don't. I think here's the thing. Like, so I would say that the like when we say something like suffering, it's meaningful because what we're referencing is the agent's, report that they are feeling something that they would wish to be free from. So it's like,
From our perspective,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And even from the individual's perspective, if I was to ask you, it's like if I was trying to say like, all right, define redness, right? Define the qualia of this experience.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, I can't do that. Like it doesn't. It's not communicable.
You can compare it. You can compare it. That's all you can do, right?
Yeah, yeah, and so the meaning itself doesn't exist. It's not meaningful.
Right. And I
Um,
think I think that, I think we're getting stuck on the. I feel like I'm not conveying it well, using the term meaning, because I think that's so. Meaning in the sense is kind of removed from the experiencer. I want to try to use a term here, and I don't know if you could help me with this. Maybe you could understand what I'm getting at and help me with some term that might work better for this purpose. But the actual perception of the experience is only ever had by the subject,
mhm.
and it's powerful to us, or it's impactful to us because we have this experience, but we can't ever escape this experience, and we can't enter somebody else's experience. And it, would you disagree with the idea that there are individual subjects all having
No, I think
internal
we're all
subjective
individual
experiences?
subjects. Yeah, yeah. I don't like, but I
Okay.
mean, like, like so. But for example, I think that what makes us subjects, for us to be able to say like I am a subject, like use these words, is to have already found common ground in order to express and understand our subjectivity. Before that, what we exist, like where I begin and you end, is like there is no way to actually engage in that. It's actually at the point of communication. And this is where Levinas talks about the ethics of the face, the resistance of the will. When I see you resist my will, I'm like, I recognize an aspect of myself in you. And I'm like, why am I resisting myself? Pretty much. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Like, and it forces me to demarcate an aspect of my consciousness. And basically Levinas says the first thing you want to do is kill it. And because he's like, it's resisting your will, you know, and then but in their suffering, you come to the point of like, they are demanding of you not to kill them, and you can recognize that, and by doing that, they command, they come to command me as a master, and the issue is, you cannot even you kill them. It doesn't matter. The command still stands. You shouldn't have killed them. I did not want to die. You can't negate their will. It's a freedom external to your own. And so you're forced to interact with something which is external to yourself. And you're like, fuck, there's something external to myself. And like this is essentially where ethics is derived from Levinas, where he says like, and this is where like self-understanding is derived, which allows me to demarcate myself from reality, like my will from what is actually good for me as well. So like, my preference from my interests, and, to hover over my own existence. And I think that like, so when we use words like, suffering and stuff like that, these are actually, these have been built up over, countless generations and centuries of discourse, where we've actually tried to express what it means to be human and the human condition and the experiences that we have. And so we've created words like suffering to try and, hit the depth of our experience. But we know that it's not good enough, which is why we talk in things like poetry, and we try to evoke those experiences in another. And we try and like, well, wait a minute, do you want to know what it feels like? And then I try to do something to you to give you the experience of what it feels like, and that's the game that we're in.
Sure. Damn, I just don't think that that gets to.
Because I guess
I don't want to say you're wrong, but I also don't want to.
That's fair enough.
I just feel like it's.
I'm not expecting you to go away and like, oh my god, I never saw it this way before. Perspective philosophy is absolutely right about everything.
Well, I would hope to. That would be great.
No, that never happens.
Everything would be perfect.
I don't think that
I
ever
wish you
happens.
could just make my mind up for me, but no, it's still pushing back the way I'm perceiving this. I just don't see how that gets us to the same, the experience of it being the same concept. I mean, within what you said just there, that there are reasons why people create poetry to try and evoke this feeling in another subject, is kind of pointing to some truth of an idea that they are another subject and can't actually have what you have without some sort of inspiration within themselves, and that we are barred from each other's experiences. I think this kind of represents the idea that I'm trying to convey here.
Oh no, I agree that there are like lines that are barring us from our experience, from each other's experiences, but I think it also bars us from our own. Like, I don't think people realize the lack of self-knowledge that we actually have, and we're unbelievably ignorant about ourselves. In fact, I think people come to know us better than we know ourselves a lot of the time. I mean, shit, I know Google knows me better than I know myself, like, just based on, like, and it's the same thing. It's the same thing with your friends, your family around you. There are two selves in the Lacanian sense. There is the self from which I intend and I act within the world, and then there is the self at the point of enunciation. And this allows him to overcome the liar paradox, which is what Kane brought up, which is why I was like, I'll actually, and he's like, oh, well, what about the liar paradox? And it's like, all right, I'll answer that. And it's like from the Lacanian position, because it's like, there are two aspects of yourself, one from which you're aware and one from which you are not. You are actually only expressing your true self in your enunciation. And he gives the example of an individual who, he goes to give advice to a colleague. Actually, I think this was somebody else who gave this example. He goes to give advice to a colleague. The colleague says, "Oh, I'm thinking about proposing to me." He thinks that, the colleague's thinking about. He's been told to propose to his girlfriend or something, and at the same time, somebody asks him, should you go down this business venture? And he goes, never commit. You know? And the words that he uses in the scenario reveal mental states that he might actually be unaware of in himself. He's revealing his own subconscious and his own psyche and this is the whole point of like psychoanalysis, from like, you know, you actually get people to just sort of talk themselves into like saying enough words from which they don't even realize what they're saying, and then you go, did you know that you keep bringing up your mom? You know, and they're like, what? Like, you know, like, what do you mean I keep bringing up my mom? And then, like, you know, and then they're like, oh, shit. And then, like, you hit a point, and that's usually at the point in which an individual already recognizes they don't know about themselves to hit therapy. I mean, before that, most people are, like, living in, like, fucking, like, oh, I know exactly how I am. But in reality, they're actually going around, you know, fulfilling neuroses. And then the neuroses break down and they feel like absolutely unfulfilled and unhappy in their lives. And they're like, doctor, the neuroses aren't working anymore. My coping mechanisms aren't making me happy. Why can't I use my coping mechanisms anymore? And they go to try and get their coping mechanisms to work again. And then they find themselves actually like having to delve into their psyches to find out why they're using the coping mechanisms in the first place. And like 100%, I think that this is the way it works. And I think that this is from the subjective experience. Like the fact that we are subjects, that we come from this, like this position is why we're in this scenario. Because if we were purely an objective, you know, being, then we would have already had this knowledge, we would already gain it, and it wouldn't be an issue. But we have to gain our subjectivity, we have to elevate ourselves into objectivity to understand ourselves. And this is why Hegel says there is only the self understanding the self. It's still idealism, you know?
All right.
Sorry for
There's
that
a lot there.
Tangent.
No, that's okay. This is one of the things I wanted to. I was hoping to learn a lot from you. I definitely have to go, but yeah, hopefully this was useful. Hopefully this provided some insight.
I really enjoyed it, man. Yeah. Sorry.
I got a bit out of it. It's difficult to process some of these things in a conversation because a lot of this stuff is really dense and you refer to a lot of things very specifically that I'm not familiar with. So I'll have to go back on this, refer to some of the things that you offered, and then, you know, dwell on this more.
And then we can always have another conversation, man.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. Hopefully we can. And because there are a number of things that I wanted to ask you about too, of things you've brought up in other debates too, like what you consider to be a right, like human, in the sense of human rights, and various things. But yeah, I'll ruminate on this stuff, and I really appreciate the conversation. It's been fun. Hope it's been good for other people too.
Yeah, man, I've really enjoyed it, and I hope the vaccine goes well. I hope your arm's not too sore afterwards. You know, like yeah, like glad to hear that you're one of the good ones getting the vaccine, and not one of the ones that's telling everyone that they're gonna die in some sort of like you know, like dystopian understanding of it. Because my God, like I was having to debunk people like actually just misrepresenting data like so bad, like saying that, like linking the CDC and then saying there was a 5% chance of dying from the vaccine and stuff like that. It's like, whoa, what the fuck? Like the CDC have said it's a 0.0018% chance, and it's and then that was in relation to people who died 2 weeks after receiving the vaccine, but there was no relation to the vaccine from when they died anyway. So it's like, what the fuck? Like just how did you even manage to do that?
Yeah, there are these very specific events, and I think one unfortunate thing that I see, especially in my area, there's a lot of people. It's more of the type of area where a lot of people would push back against getting the vaccine, if you can kind of understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, it happens. Yeah, it happens.
And so it's even more important here. But it's just frustrating, the information you get from people where you can tell that they just picked it up off of like somebody making an inflammatory post or something like that, or just a headline from some
like kind of post,
irrefutable,
Twitter or something.
It's frustrating.
It is really frustrating, and I think that another thing is like even in relation to that, like that's where I would say that like, you know, the objectivity of ethics is in relation to that. It's like even understanding what a vaccine is and the ontology of reality in itself is an aspect of language from which we're engaged in, and we're engaged in trying to understand reality in the first sense to try and engage to express what subjectivity. So even if we assume an end goal, we have to understand reality, and if we have to understand reality, then we have to engage with the other. If we have to engage with the other, then we have to engage with the other in a way that's sincere, because if we try to assert that reality is a certain way, then we've already lost our understanding of reality, and this is the kind of language games that I think are going on. And so I think like, yeah, so
Yeah.
well, thanks anyway.
All right. Yeah. Appreciate the conversation. So I'm gonna head out now.
Appreciate it, man. Take it easy, and
Right.
and good luck. Bye.
All right, bye.
Right. I hope you've all enjoyed that conversation. I actually I'm really tired. I've been up for like quite a while now. Been up since like 4 a.m. I will be streaming on Patreon tomorrow as a nice Easter stream. I was thinking about like maybe talking about like what is salvation, and some like Christian concepts on there. Things like that, and like, you know, thick moral concepts, because I do love myself some thick moral concepts. But yeah, and I hope you've all enjoyed the stream. You know, heard me ramble on about what a moral obligation is, and yeah, and thank you again to Cloud of Time, Eric, for coming on. Very much appreciated. And obviously thank you, Jeremy, and you know, Tomato, and Vegan Something, Burner Man, Edward, Zelinki, Alfred. I've seen your comments, as I've Barkat. I've seen your comments as I've Socked Gem. And Wooden Oil, by the way, I will actually get back to you. We can have a discussion, like an informal chat or whatever it is, happily, and we can talk about ethics. So yeah, 100%. And yeah, I would definitely be game for a second conversation with Cloud of Time. So yeah. And I'm glad to hear that Jeremy hasn't eaten meat since you've debated us. I'm very glad to hear that, Jeremy. So I'm going to go off now, guys. And I hope you've all enjoyed this stream. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing. And if you're on Twitch, you know, follow. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate it, guys. Thank you to all my patrons on Patreon. Obviously, if you want to consider becoming a patron, check out the perks below. I'll be on there tomorrow. Thank you to Jeremy, Brick, Ben, and Jeremy, Brick, Ben. I know I'm missing someone. No brain, don't do this to me. Ethan, there we go. Jeremy, Brick, Ben, Ethan, and Lazarus. Thank you very much. Your donations really help the channel, and thank you all who have donated through Patreon and donated in general to the channel. It really does help. Got a nice intro coming soon, so that's like the next thing. So that's really cool. Hope you guys have a lovely night, and as always, try to gain some perspective.